The clash of swords and the thunder of charging armies, these are the sounds we imagine when we think of medieval warfare. But what if the most powerful weapon on the battlefield wasn't a blade or a siege engine, but something far more unexpected? What if the fate of kingdoms hung not on the strength of soldiers, but on the fragile pages of a love letter? Hidden in the shadows of history, there's a secret thread woven through the blood and chaos of war, a thread spun from ink, passion, and whispered words. This is the story of how love letters, exchanged between enemies, became the unseen force that toppled alliances, exposed betrayals, and even brought wars to an end. Picture this: a nobleman sworn to his king, slipping a sealed letter to a trusted messenger under cover of darkness. The parchment bears no battle plans, no strategies, just the trembling words of a heart torn between duty and desire. Across enemy lines, a noblewoman reads those words, her own heart racing. She holds not just a confession of love, but a weapon more dangerous than any sword. Because in a world where marriages were treaties and every whisper could shift the balance of power, love wasn't just a feeling, it was a political act. And when those letters fell into the wrong hands, they didn't just break hearts, they changed history. From the courts of France to the castles of England, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Italian city-states, these forbidden exchanges became the silent architects of war and peace. Kings rose and fell because of them. Battles were won or lost over lines penned in secret. And today, we're going to unravel these extraordinary stories, tales of passion that defied borders, of risks taken for love, and of how the simplest words could alter the destiny of nations. This isn't just a story about letters. It's about the invisible ties that bound enemies together, the power of emotion in a world ruled by cold steel, and the moments when love, against all odds, rewrote the rules of war. So let's step into the shadows of the past, where ink-stained fingers held more power than any sword, and where the heart's quietest whispers could echo across centuries. In the cutthroat world of medieval politics, where every handshake hid a dagger and every smile masked a scheme, the written word carried an almost magical power. A love letter wasn't just parchment and ink. It was a loaded weapon capable of unraveling years of careful diplomacy in an instant. Consider the story of Elina of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. When her passionate letters to her uncle Raymond during the Second Crusade were intercepted, the scandal didn't just humiliate her husband, King Louis VII of France. It fractured their marriage, dissolved their alliance, and ultimately reshaped the map of Europe. But why were these letters so explosive? In a time when royal marriages were essentially peace treaties written in flesh and blood, love outside those bonds wasn't just scandalous, it was treason. A noble caught in a forbidden affair wasn't merely risking their reputation, they were gambling with the stability of entire kingdoms. Take the case of Richard the Lionheart and Berengaria of Navarre. Their courtship letters, exchanged while Richard was betrothed to another, nearly sparked a war with France. When the jilted bride's family discovered the correspondence, it took the intervention of the Pope himself to prevent bloodshed. The danger wasn't just in the act of writing, it was in the delivery. Messengers carrying these letters faced ambushes, bribes, and torture. Seals could be broken, wax could be melted, and ink could be forged. Yet despite the risks, the flow of secret letters never stopped, because for every intercepted message that started a war, there was another that quietly ended one. In 1485, a series of tender letters between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, then rivals for the Spanish throne, softened their hostility. leading to a marriage that united Spain and expelled the Moors. Love, it seems, could be as decisive as any battlefield victory. Perhaps the most astonishing part, many of these letters weren't even written by the lovers themselves. Scribes often composed them, carefully crafting each phrase to balance raw emotion with political calculation. A single metaphor about unbreakable bonds might secretly reference a military alliance, while a line about eternal devotion could hint at shared enemies. These weren't just love notes, they were diplomatic cables in poetic disguise, and when they fell into the wrong hands, the consequences echoed far beyond two hearts. They redirected armies, toppled crowns, and proved time and again that in the Game of Thrones, sometimes the pen truly was mightier than the sword. The whispers surrounding Elena of Aquitaine and her son, Richard the Lionheart, revealed just how fragile a ruler's power could be when personal passions collided with political necessity. Though historians still debate the exact nature of their correspondence, medieval chroniclers paint a tantalizing picture. Letters slipped between enemy camps, their contents so explosive they threatened to unravel Richard's carefully constructed alliances during the Third Crusade. The most persistent rumor, that Elina, acting as regent while her son fought in the Holy Land, exchanged secret missives with Count Raymond of Tripoli, a nobleman whose loyalty to Richard's rival, Philip of France, was no secret. What made these letters so dangerous wasn't just their existence, it was their timing. Richard's crusade hung by a thread, reliant on uneasy truces between fractious allies. When whispers spread that his own mother might be cultivating ties with a French sympathizer, the scandal didn't just tarnish reputations, it shook the foundations of military strategy. Suddenly, Richard's barons questioned whether their gold and soldiers were being squandered on a campaign undermined by family intrigues back home. The backlash forced Richard's hand. To salvage his crusade, he had to publicly reaffirm alliances, surrender disputed territories, and even postpone key battles, all concessions born not from battlefield losses, but from the fear of what those letters might contain. Yet the real intrigue lies in what we don't know. No surviving letters between Elina and Raymond have ever been found, leaving historians to piece together the truth from furious diary entries by Richard's clerks and sly asides in French court chronicles. Some suggest Elina wasn't plotting betrayal at all, that her letters were merely diplomatic overtures, twisted by enemies to sow discord. Others argue the correspondence was deliberate, a mother's attempt to shield her son by cultivating back-channel peace talks. Whatever the reality, the fallout proved one undeniable truth. In medieval power games, perception often mattered more than fact. A single rumored letter could do more damage than 1,000 enemy knights, because trust, once broken on parchment, was nearly impossible to rebuild on the battlefield. This episode also reveals a startling paradox of medieval politics. The very women barred from wielding swords often held immense influence through the written word. Elina, forbidden from leading armies, shaped wars anyway by mastering the art of the letter. Her inkwell was her arsenal, each carefully chosen word a strategic strike. And when those words escaped her control, they didn't just alter her son's crusade, they rewrote the playbook on how love, loyalty, and deception could redefine the borders of empires. The story of Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer reads like a medieval thriller, a tale of forbidden love, coded messages, and a plot so daring it toppled a king. While history remembers Isabella as the she-wolf of France, few realize her rebellion began not with swords, but with ink. Married to the unpopular Edward II, Isabella found herself trapped in a court rife with favoritism and discontent. When she met Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron imprisoned for defying the king, Their initial letters were likely just shared grievances, but as their correspondence grew bolder, so did their plans. Smuggling letters past Edward's spies required ingenuity. Some were hidden inside hollowed-out prayer books, others stitched into the linings of merchants' cloaks. The most dangerous messages used subtle wordplay. A line about harvesting roses might signal the mustering of troops, while a reference to spring's arrival could mark the date for their coup. Every phrase carried double meanings, every metaphor a veiled instruction. When one of these letters was nearly intercepted by a suspicious courier, Mortimer reportedly paid a fortune in bribes to keep it secret. Close call didn't deter them, it forced their hand. Within months, Isabella and Mortimer's words became action. Their letters had secretly rallied England's discontented nobles, and when Isabella landed with an army in 1326, Edward found himself abandoned by his own court. The king's downfall wasn't just a military defeat, it was the culmination of a paper revolution. Even Edward's forced abdication document, the first of its kind in English history, bore traces of Isabella and Mortimer's earlier correspondence, echoing phrases about failed stewardship and the people's welfare. Yet the ultimate irony, the very letters that brought them power also sealed their fate. After Mortimer's execution and Isabella's political exile, their once treasured messages were used against them as evidence of treason. Parchment had given them a crown and then taken it away. This wasn't just a love story or a rebellion. It was proof that in the medieval world, the right words in the right hands could shake thrones, and that sometimes the most dangerous wars were fought not on battlefields, but in the margins of a love letter. Marie de Champagne never intended to start a war. Her letters to Charles of Anjou were meant to be olive branches, carefully crafted appeals for peace between their rival houses. Fluent in Latin and French, she chose each word with precision, knowing how easily royal egos bruised. But in the autumn of 1267, a single phrase slipped past her scrutiny. When her letter reached Charles's court in Naples, a sleep-deprived scribe misread her elegant script, turning a diplomatic nicety into a perceived slight. The word honor became horror. The phrase, "Your noble house honors this agreement," now declared, "Your noble house horrifies this court." Charles, already simmering over border disputes, saw red. He summoned his council, waving the mangled translation like a battle standard. Within days, couriers galloped across his territories with orders to muster troops. By the time Marie learned of the mistake, Charles's army had already crossed into her lands, torching villages in retaliation for an insult she never gave. What followed wasn't just another petty feudal skirmish. It became a year-long bloodbath that dragged in allies from Burgundy to Aragon, all because one tired man misread a single word. The tragedy deepens when you realize how close they'd been to peace. Marie's original letter, preserved in a Paris archive, reveals pages of concessions, trade routes reopened, disputed castles offered as collateral. She'd even proposed a marriage alliance to seal the truce. None of it mattered once that fatal error inked its way into history. The war bankrupted both families, cost nearly 4,000 lives, and left a bitterness that lingered for generations. This wasn't just a failure of translation, it was a flaw in the entire medieval system of diplomacy. Without standardized spelling or professional translators, meaning hinged on the shaky hands of underpaid scribes. Seals guaranteed authenticity but not accuracy. A single blot could turn a compliment into a curse, a plea into a provocation. Marie and Charles's story exposes the terrifying power of the written word in an era where corrections moved at the speed of a galloping horse, but consequences unfolded at the speed of wildfire. Long after the last battle, the real lesson remained. In a world where trust was written in ink, sometimes the deadliest wounds came not from swords, but from slips of the pen. The French court knew her as the widow of Clermont, a grieving countess who wrote poetry to ease her loneliness. What they didn't know was that her quill was sharper than any dagger. In 1421, as the 100 Years' War raged, Yolande of Clermont began exchanging letters with Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, a key English commander known for his vanity and temper. Her first missive was a masterpiece of deception, delicate condolences for his late wife, flattering comparisons to legendary knights, and just enough vulnerability to suggest a heart ripe for consolation. By the third letter, she'd spun a web so convincing that Humphrey began boasting of military victories he hadn't yet won, detailing troop movements between professions of devotion. What made Yolande's scheme so devastating was its simplicity. She never asked for secrets outright. She let pride do the work for her. Humphrey, eager to impress his poetic admirer, littered his replies with careless hints. The number of ships docked at Calais, the morale of his archers after a harsh winter, even the exact date his reinforcements were expected from Normandy. Yolande's scribes copied every word before the letters reached her, forwarding the intelligence to French commanders. For 8 months, this paper courtship bled the English war effort dry, as French ambushes intercepted supply convoys and raids targeted undermanned garrisons, all timed perfectly to Humphrey's unguarded confessions. The unraveling came when a drunken English courier bragged about the Duke's foreign sweetheart at a tavern. French spies, ironically, uncovered the plot first. Yolande's own handlers hadn't trusted her with the full network. When confronted, Humphrey didn't just burn her letters, he burned entire villages in retaliation, diverting troops from critical fronts to salvage his wounded pride. His reckless offensive at Verneuil, launched against all strategic advice, became a slaughter that cost England its foothold in Normandy. This wasn't just espionage, it was psychological warfare waged with sealing wax. Yolande exploited the unspoken rule of medieval nobility, that love letters existed outside the battlefield's brutality, a sacred space where even enemies could be vulnerable. By weaponizing that trust, she proved how easily the pen could outmaneuver the sword. Centuries later, historians still debate whether she ever felt a flicker of guilt when signing those letters, "Forever yours." But one truth remains: in the shadow war of ink and parchment, the most dangerous lies were the ones wrapped in affection. The siege of Montségur in 1243 should have been another brutal footnote in the Albigensian crusade, another fortress reduced to rubble, another population scattered or slaughtered. The Cathar stronghold had held out for months against Simon de Montfort's forces, its walls crumbling under relentless bombardment. But history took an unexpected turn when a single parchment changed everything. Not a military dispatch or a royal decree, but a love letter from Simon's wife, Amicia, slipped past his guards and into the hands of the town's defenders. Amicia's words were no ordinary plea. She wrote of their children's fevers back home, of empty chairs at the hearth, of prayers whispered in the dark for a husband who seemed lost to war's cruelty. Most devastatingly, she recounted a nightmare where Simon returned victorious only to find his own soul blackened beyond recognition. The letter wasn't just a wife's lament, it was a mirror held up to a commander who'd begun to forget why he fought. When the town's besieged leaders deliberately returned the unopened letter to Simon with a message of their own, "We would not rob any man of his humanity, even as he tries to rob us of our lives," the effect was volcanic. Eyewitness accounts describe Simon retreating to his tent for 3 days, emerging with red-rimmed eyes and a shocking order: the siege would end, not with the Cathars' annihilation, but with negotiated surrender. Families were spared the sword, given safe passage to neighboring lands. Some historians argue practical concerns forced Simon's hand, dwindling supplies approaching winter. But his own chaplain's diary tells a different story. That night, Simon burned every siege map in his possession, murmuring about letters that travel farther than arrows. This moment rippled far beyond Montsega's walls. Across Europe, commanders began receiving similar appeals: wives, mothers, even children penning desperate letters to pull loved ones back from war's brink. The Church, alarmed by this erosion of military discipline, decreed that soldiers' correspondence must be screened for sentimental interference. Yet the genie couldn't be forced back into the bottle. Montséga proved that even in an age of iron and blood, the frailest parchment could carry the weight of 1,000 swords, because when a hardened warrior paused to remember he was also a husband, a father, a man, that's when history turned not on strategy, but on something far older and more powerful: the stubborn belief that even enemies might still hear each other's hearts. The Vatican's gilded halls have witnessed centuries of intrigue, but few scandals cut as deeply as the one that threatened to unravel the papacy of Pius II. Before his rise to the throne of St. Peter, the future pope had been a young humanist scholar named Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, a man whose passionate letters to a German noblewoman named Eleanor of Austria would come back to haunt him decades later. Their correspondence, filled with poetic declarations and political musings, might have remained forgotten had they not surfaced at the worst possible moment, when Pius was locked in a bitter struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over control of church lands. The timing couldn't have been more disastrous. Just as Pius needed to project unwavering moral authority, his enemies dredged up those old letters, twisting innocent phrases into evidence of impropriety. A line about nights spent dreaming of your wisdom became fodder for whispers of clandestine meetings. A passing reference to Eleanor's unmatched grace was framed as proof of forbidden attachment. In truth, the letters were likely the flowery excesses of a young intellectual, but in the charged atmosphere of 15th century Rome, perception mattered more than intent. What followed was a masterclass in damage control. Rather than deny the letters, Pius took the extraordinary step of openly revising them, commissioning scribes to edit the originals with more restrained language before allowing copies to circulate. He even referenced the scandal in a public sermon, joking that even popes were once foolish youths, a disarmingly human admission that diffused tensions while quietly reminding the world of his scholarly past. But the concessions didn't stop there. To silence his critics, Pius was forced to abandon reforms that would have curtailed the emperor's influence over church appointments, a political retreat that reshaped papal authority for generations. The irony is almost poetic. A man who'd spent his life crafting perfect Latin sentences found himself outmaneuvered by his own youthful words. Yet Pius's ordeal reveals a broader truth about medieval power structures. Not even the Vicar of Christ was immune to the weaponization of affection. Because in an era where spiritual and political authority were inseparable, the faintest whiff of scandal could undermine both. The Church might have claimed dominion over souls, but as Pius learned too well, it was the unguarded words of the heart that held the real power to humble kings and popes alike. Perhaps most strikingly, this episode exposes the double standard woven into medieval society. While noblemen's affairs were often tacitly accepted, the Church's leaders were held to impossible standards of purity. A single misinterpreted letter could do more damage than a dozen battlefield losses because it struck at the very foundation of spiritual legitimacy. Centuries later, the Vatican's archives still guard the originals of those fateful letters, a silent testament to the enduring truth that in the game of power, sometimes the most dangerous weapons aren't swords or siege engines, but inky traces of a younger self's unguarded thoughts. The flames that consumed Duke Francis II of Brittany's letters in 1487 didn't just burn parchment, they ignited a war. The French agents who intercepted the correspondence thought they were eliminating a political threat, proof of Brittany's secret alliance with England. But in their rush to destroy the evidence, they overlooked one volatile truth. In medieval diplomacy, the act of burning letters wasn't just concealment, it was a declaration of contempt. The Duke's messengers had been ambushed, the sealed packets torn open, and every page fed to the fire. When word reached Francis, his rage was immediate and calculated. Those letters hadn't just contained sweet nothings, they were carefully crafted promises of military support, pledges of loyalty penned in the language of love to disguise their political weight. What made the burning so incendiary wasn't just the loss of the words themselves, but the brazen violation of protocol. Medieval nobles operated on an unspoken code. Letters between rulers were sacred, their contents private even in war. Breaking a seal was tantamount to breaking trust, but reducing those words to ash, that was an insult no sovereign could ignore. Francis's response was swift and brutal. He publicly accused King Charles VIII of France of dishonoring the very heir between kingdoms, a phrase that resonated across Europe's courts. Within weeks, Brittany's envoys were sailing for London, securing the open alliance France had feared. The irony is almost too sharp to ignore. The French had burned the letters to prevent exposure, yet their destruction became the very spark that exposed everything. Without a single surviving word as evidence, imaginations ran wild. Were the letters proof of troop deployments, marriage pacts, secret loans? The uncertainty fueled paranoia on both sides, escalating tensions beyond repair. By the time French diplomats tried to walk back their actions, it was too late. The flames had already licked their way into history. The Breton War that followed wasn't just fought with swords and siege engines. It was waged over the ghost of words no one could ever read again. This episode reveals a paradox at the heart of medieval power. Sometimes the absence of evidence carried more weight than the evidence itself. In an age where reputation was currency, the destruction of those letters didn't just erase words, it crafted a narrative far more dangerous than anything Francis might have written. Because in the end, it wasn't the content of the letters that mattered. It was the fact that someone had been desperate enough to burn them, and that, more than any battlefield defeat, was the wound France could never heal. Marguerite de Valois and Henry of Navarre didn't just write love letters, they wrote in riddles. Their correspondence, exchanged during the brutal French wars of religion, looked like the flowery prose of infatuation on the surface. But between the lines of poetry about roses in winter and doves taking flight lay a cipher so clever it fooled spies for years. Each metaphor was a placeholder, a code word for troop movements, secret meetings, or alliances. A mention of harvest time might signal an impending attack, while the north wind could warn of betrayal. What appeared to be romantic drivel was actually a meticulously crafted blueprint for survival in a fractured kingdom. Their system wasn't just clever, it was necessary. Marguerite, a Catholic princess, and Henry, a Protestant king, were trapped in a marriage of political convenience while their factions slaughtered each other in the streets. Every letter they sent risked interception by extremists on both sides, ready to twist any phrase into proof of treason. So they turned their passion into a weapon, hiding treasonous plots in plain sight. When Marguerite wrote of planting lilies in barren soil, she wasn't waxing poetic, she was revealing covert plans to smuggle Protestant nobles into Catholic strongholds. Henry's reply about pruning thorns confirmed the scheme. The brilliance of their cipher lay in its flexibility. Unlike rigid substitution codes that replaced letters with symbols, their system relied on ever-shifting metaphors known only to a handful of trusted scribes. A word that meant safe passage one month might signify army provisions the next, making their letters useless to anyone without the latest key. For nearly 3 years, this linguistic dance kept their fragile alliance alive, even as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stained Paris's streets with blood, but all codes break eventually. The fatal flaw came not from a spy's brilliance, but from a lover's carelessness. Henry's trusted courier, drunk on stolen wine, bragged about carrying letters that could topple kings at a Lyon tavern. Within days, Catholic cryptographers were dissecting every metaphor, comparing old letters for patterns. The final blow came when a defecting scribe revealed the cipher's structure, how references to seasons marked timelines, how flower names denoted cities. The decoded letters exposed Marguerite and Henry's secret negotiations with German mercenaries, a revelation that shattered the already fragile truce between Catholics and Huguenots. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Marguerite was placed under house arrest, her rooms searched for more ciphered notes. Henry narrowly escaped assassination, his forces scrambling to adjust battle plans now laid bare. Yet the real tragedy wasn't the betrayal's exposure, it was how close they'd come to peace. The decoded letters revealed detailed proposals for religious tolerance, land redistribution, even shared governance, ideas decades ahead of their time. Had their cipher held, France might have avoided years of bloodshed. Instead, the cracked code became a cautionary tale, proving that in the shadow war of secrets and symbols, even the cleverest disguises could unravel. What lingers most hauntingly is the duality of their legacy. Today, historians pore over those same letters, marveling at how Marguerite and Henry weaponized language itself. Their words were both shield and sword, a love story written in smoke signals, flickering brightly before the winds of war blew them apart. In the end, their cipher didn't just conceal messages, it revealed something far more profound, that even in an age of relentless violence, the human hunger for connection could forge codes as intricate as any crown's diplomacy. And sometimes the most dangerous secrets weren't the ones hidden in plain sight, but the ones written between the lines of the heart. Emperor Maximilian I of Habsburg wrote his most fateful letter not on parchment, but on the back of a playing card, a hasty, impulsive note to Bianca Maria Sforza, sister of his bitter rival Ludovico of Milan. What began as a flirtatious whim would unravel decades of careful Habsburg diplomacy. The year was 1494, and Maximilian had recently become a widower. His advisors urged him to remarry strategically, perhaps to strengthen ties with Spain or Burgundy. But when he met Bianca at a tournament in Verona, politics gave way to passion. That first note, scrawled between jousting matches, contained only 23 words. "Your eyes hold more kingdoms than I've conquered. Meet me where the falcons nest at dusk." The problem wasn't the affair itself. Nobles often took lovers outside marriage. The catastrophe came when Ludovico's spies intercepted later letters proving Maximilian had promised Bianca more than stolen kisses. In flowery prose, the emperor had pledged to support Milan against Venice, even hinting at military intervention. These weren't just love letters, they were unsigned treaties. When Ludovico leaked them to Venice's doge, the reaction was volcanic. Venice immediately reached out to France, offering access to Alpine passes in exchange for protection against Habsburg aggression. Maximilian's romantic gamble set off a chain reaction that would haunt his descendants for generations. The leaked correspondence poisoned relations between the Habsburgs and Italian states at the worst possible moment, just as France's Charles VIII was marching south to claim Naples. Suddenly, Maximilian found himself isolated, his usual allies wary of a ruler who mixed pillow talk with statecraft. Even his eventual marriage to Bianca couldn't repair the damage. The wedding, intended to salvage his reputation, only deepened suspicions that Habsburg policy was becoming erratic, swayed by personal whims rather than imperial strategy. But the true cost became apparent decades later. The mistrust sown by those letters festered, making it impossible for Maximilian's grandson, Charles V, to maintain a united front against the Ottomans or Protestant reformers. Italian bankers hesitated to fund Habsburg campaigns, remembering how easily their grandfathers' promises could be broken. The dynasty that once seemed destined to rule Europe found itself constantly firefighting rebellions and bankruptcies, not because they lacked soldiers or gold, but because they'd lost something far more precious: the credibility that turns temporary victories into lasting power. What makes this episode so haunting isn't just the political fallout, but the intimacy of its undoing. Most dynasties crumble under the weight of lost battles or failed harvests. The Habsburgs' decline began with something far simpler: a lonely emperor reaching for companionship, and in that vulnerable moment handing his enemies the perfect weapon. Because in the end, the greatest threat to their empire wasn't an army at the gates, it was the words they never meant the world to see. Adelaide of Burgundy never imagined her private plea for peace would become the spark that ended a war. The year was 951, and her small kingdom was caught between Otto the Great's expanding Holy Roman Empire and the rebellious Duke Conrad of Lorraine. Desperate to stop the bloodshed, Adelaide penned a letter to Otto, not as a queen to an emperor, but as one grieving ruler to another. She wrote of villages emptied by hunger, of children who knew only the sound of marching boots, and of her own loneliness in a court hollowed out by loss. Every word was raw, unguarded, meant for Otto's eyes alone, but fate had other plans. The messenger, blinded by a sudden snowstorm, strayed into Conrad's camp instead. When the Duke's soldiers seized the letter, they expected battle plans or secret alliances. What they found was something far more disarming: a woman's aching cry for an end to the killing. Conrad, hardened by years of rebellion, hesitated. Here was no political maneuvering, no veiled threats, just Adelaide's quiet confession that no crown is worth the silence left behind when too many have fallen. Against all expectations, the rebel Duke did something extraordinary. He sent the letter onward to Otto with his own addition, a single line pledging to lay down arms if the emperor would meet him under a banner of truce. The ripple effect was immediate. Otto, moved by Adelaide's vulnerability and Conrad's unexpected humility, agreed to negotiations. Chroniclers described the meeting as unlike any other in living memory. No posturing, no demands, just three rulers who'd been reminded of the human cost behind their rivalries. The resulting Treaty of Aachen didn't just end their conflict. It established a system of neutral monasteries where future disputes could be mediated by scribes and saints rather than swords. What makes this moment so remarkable is its sheer improbability. Medieval warfare rarely paused for empathy, let alone because of a misdelivered letter. Yet Adelaide's words, never intended for Conrad, pierced armor no weapon could breach. Her plea worked precisely because it wasn't a calculated diplomatic gesture. It was a truth too heavy to bear alone, spilling onto parchment in a moment of exhaustion. In an age where letters were often tools of manipulation, this one became something far more rare, a mirror held up to the shared fragility behind enemy lines. The deeper lesson lingers long after the ink faded. Sometimes peace isn't won through strength or strategy, but through the unplanned moments when adversaries glimpse each other's unguarded humanity. Adelaide, Otto, and Conrad proved that even in the darkest conflicts, the right words in the wrong hands could become the bridge no one knew they needed. And perhaps that's the most surprising power of these lost letters: their ability to turn accidents into miracles and enemies into architects of peace. Theophanu of Byzantium arrived in Rome as a bride meant to unite empires. Her marriage to Otto II was a golden thread stitching east and west together. But when a chest of her letters to General Nikephoros was unearthed in 983, that thread snapped with a violence that would fracture the Holy Roman Empire for generations. The correspondence itself wasn't treasonous, mostly discussions of Byzantine military tactics and nostalgic musings about Constantinople's gardens. But for Otto, already insecure about his Germanic nobles questioning his foreign empress, the letters were proof of something darker, a wife whose loyalties might never fully belong to him. What transformed this private rift into a political earthquake was the way Otto handled his fury. Instead of confronting Theophanu privately, he staged a grotesque spectacle at the Diet of Verona. Before hundreds of assembled nobles, he had a scribe read aloud her most intimate lines, not just the strategic notes, but passages where she confessed loneliness, where she called Nikephoros the last remnant of home. The effect was devastating. By exposing his wife's vulnerability as evidence of betrayal, Otto didn't just humiliate Theophanu, he shattered the illusion of imperial unity. German dukes who'd resented her influence seized the moment, declaring her correspondence proof that Byzantine interests had infiltrated the court. Theophanu's retaliation was subtle but brilliant. Rather than deny the letters, she weaponized Otto's own cruelty against him. She began appearing in public dressed in full Byzantine regalia, speaking Greek to her attendants, deliberately leaning into the exoticism that unsettled the Germans. Her silent defiance turned her into a living symbol of the cultural divide Otto had exposed. Within months, the empire split along ideological lines, German nobles rallying behind Otto, while Italian and Burgundian territories quietly pledged allegiance to Theophanu. The schism outlasted them both, setting the stage for centuries of conflict between papal and imperial authority. The real tragedy: the letters were likely innocent all along. Modern scholars note that Byzantine noblewomen frequently corresponded with generals. It was considered part of their diplomatic role. What doomed Theophanu wasn't the content of her words, but the fact they existed at all in a world that feared powerful women. Otto's overreaction exposed a truth more dangerous than any treason: that the empire's unity had always been fragile, held together by performative loyalty rather than true trust. And when that performance failed, the cracks spread faster than any army could march. This episode reveals a paradox at the heart of medieval power. Letters between enemies could sometimes build bridges, but letters between spouses could burn them down. Because while love letters between rival nobles carried the thrill of forbidden alliance, a queen's correspondence with her homeland carried the whisper of divided allegiance. Theophanu's story isn't just about betrayal, it's about how the written word, once unleashed, could turn even a marriage bed into a battlefield where empires bled out. William IX of Aquitaine didn't just write poetry, he waged war with it. Known as the first troubadour, this brash duke turned courtly love into a weapon sharper than any lance. His verses flowed with honeyed words and venomous subtext, each rhyme a carefully aimed strike at his enemies' reputations. But his most infamous composition, a series of poems mocking the wife of Count William of Poitiers, didn't just bruise egos. It ignited a conflict that would ravage southwestern France for nearly a decade. At first glance, the poems seemed like playful courtly banter, the kind nobles exchanged to pass long winter evenings. But beneath the surface, every stanza carried calculated barbs. One particularly cutting verse described the Countess as a rose without scent, a song without tune, implying her inability to produce an heir. Another mocked her family's waning influence, comparing their castle to a cuckoo's nest, borrowed and soon abandoned. In an age where lineage and honor were everything, these weren't just insults. they were declarations of war in meter and rhyme. The Count's response was swift and brutal. He banned William's musicians from his lands, burned copies of the poems in public squares, and most damningly withdrew his troops from a crucial campaign against Norman raiders. This last act sent shockwaves through the region. Without Poitiers' forces, Aquitaine's borders were left vulnerable, forcing William to divert resources from other fronts. What began as a war of words quickly escalated into raids, burned villages, and a bitter trade embargo that starved both territories of vital goods. What makes this conflict so extraordinary is how it reveals the dual nature of medieval poetry. On one hand, troubadour verses were celebrated as the height of cultured expression, a refined art form that separated nobility from commoners. Yet in the wrong hands, or rather the right ones, those same verses could become instruments of chaos. William understood something his rivals underestimated. In a society where reputation was armor, a well-crafted poem could pierce where swords could not. The fallout lasted long after the fighting ceased. William's descendants would inherit not just his lands, but his knack for lyrical warfare. His granddaughter Elina of Aquitaine would later use poetry to sway public opinion during her divorce from Louis VII, proving that the pen's power outlived its wielder. Meanwhile, the Count's family never fully recovered from the humiliation. Their lineage faded into obscurity, their castles crumbling while William's verses survived in illuminated manuscripts, a testament to the enduring power of words to build dynasties or bury them. This wasn't just a feud between two hot-tempered nobles. It was a turning point in how medieval Europe understood influence. After William, rulers across the continent began employing poets as shadow diplomats, their verses carrying messages too dangerous to state plainly. A compliment about a lady's beauty might secretly promise military support, while a lament about winter's chill could signal economic troubles ahead. Poetry became the perfect disguise, respectable enough to circulate openly, yet flexible enough to hide daggers between its lines. The irony, William himself seemed to grasp the monster he'd unleashed. In his later years, he wrote a remorseful verse comparing his tongue to a runaway horse that trampled gardens never meant to cross. But by then, the damage was done. He'd proven that in the right hands, a quill could be deadlier than a quiver of arrows, and that sometimes the most lasting wounds weren't inflicted on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when ink met parchment and pride burned brighter than reason. The Scottish borderlands in 1321 were a patchwork of shifting loyalties and simmering grudges, where even the most trusted messengers traveled armed. So when Duncan of Mar set out from Stirling Castle with a letter for his betrothed, Lady Isabella of Douglas, he carried more than parchment. He carried a secret that could topple kingdoms. The letter, sealed with Duncan's ring and written in Isabel's own hand, appeared to be a simple love note, but between phrases praising his steadfast heart and longing for their next meeting lay a cipher known only to Scotland's rebel lords, a detailed plan to ambush English forces at Berwick-upon-Tweed. Duncan never reached the Douglas stronghold. A sudden fog veered him off course, straight into an English patrol near Roxburgh. What happened next remains a subject of debate. Some chronicles claim he panicked and reached for his dagger, others that the English captain noticed the wax seal bore the Douglas crest, a family notorious for rebellion. Either way, the letter was torn open, its innocent surface scratched away to reveal lemon juice writing invisible at first glance. The hidden message laid bare everything: dates, names, even the planned signal. A bonfire lit on Lammermuir Hill when the English garrison was at its weakest. King Edward II's response was merciless. Rather than arrest the conspirators and risk a drawn-out trial, he ordered a surprise attack on Douglas Castle under cover of darkness. Isabel's brother and 6 other nobles were slaughtered in their beds, their heads mounted on pikes along the border as a warning. The preemptive strike crushed the rebellion before a single sword could be raised in the field, buying England another decade of uneasy control over southern Scotland. But the real tragedy lay in the aftermath. Duncan, imprisoned in the Tower of London, was forced to watch as his blunder rippled far beyond that misty border road. Without Douglas' leadership, smaller uprisings collapsed into disarray. Scottish chroniclers later claimed Robert the Bruce himself had secretly endorsed the plot, meaning Duncan's misstep didn't just doom a handful of nobles, it delayed Scotland's independence by years. This wasn't just a messenger's error, it was a hinge moment where history turned on something as fragile as a man's sense of direction. The incident exposed the terrifying vulnerability of medieval intelligence networks. After 1321, Scottish rebels adopted a brutal new protocol. Messengers memorized their letters word for word, then burned them. Some went further, slicing their tongues to prevent torture from extracting secrets. The English, meanwhile, began training scribes to detect invisible inks, turning border castles into laboratories where letters were held over flames or dipped in chemicals. What makes this episode so chilling isn't just the violence it unleashed, but the fragility it reveals. In an age without maps or reliable roads, when even seasoned travelers could vanish in a sudden storm, the fate of nations often rested on the weakest link: a tired horse, a misread landmark, or one messenger's unlucky turn. Duncan's story forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Sometimes history doesn't pivot on grand speeches or epic battles, but on silent moments when a single footstep veers left instead of right, scattering lives like fallen leaves in its wake. Duchess Matilda of Tuscany kept her diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard in a private chapel, or so she thought. The leather-bound pages held more than midnight musings. They pulsed with unguarded confessions about her forbidden love for Guelph of Bavaria, a man whose family had warred with hers for generations. Her words painted a portrait of stolen glances at imperial diets, of prayers for his safety in battle, even fantasies of abandoning her titles to meet him in secret. These were the trembling thoughts of a woman torn between duty and desire, never meant for any eyes but her own, until the night a disgruntled scribe, bribed with Venetian gold, slipped the diary into the hands of her enemies. What followed wasn't just blackmail, it was psychological warfare perfected. Emperor Henry IV's advisors didn't demand gold or land. They wanted something far more valuable: Canossa, the impregnable fortress guarding the Apennine passes. For years, Matilda had defied imperial armies from those towering walls, her strategic brilliance turning the mountain stronghold into a legend. Now, her enemies held up her own words like a mirror, threatening to expose her heart's secrets to the very vassals who worshipped her as the Iron Countess. The choice was brutal: surrender Canossa or watch her carefully crafted image shatter, along with the loyalty of knights who'd followed her into hell believing her devotion to Tuscany was absolute. The diary's pages reveal the depth of her torment. In one frantic entry, she raged against the coward's weapon of stolen privacy. In another, she drafted, then crossed out, a letter to Guelph begging for intervention. But the most telling mark isn't ink, it's the faint tear stain warping a single sentence. I built my life on being feared, now I'll lose it for being human. Matilda's surrender of Canossa in 1082 stunned Europe. Chroniclers spun tales of military fatigue or divine intervention, never guessing the truth. The fortress fell without a single arrow loosed, its gates opened by a woman who'd rather lose stone walls than watch her love be weaponized against her people. Because that was the cruelest twist, Henry's men didn't just threaten to expose her feelings, they vowed to frame Guelph as the seducer, painting their affection as a Bavarian plot to weaken Tuscany. The ensuing purge would have drowned northern Italy in blood. Yet the diary's survival tells another story. Somehow, Matilda reclaimed it, scraping away incriminating passages, but leaving enough to ensure history would one day know the cost of that surrender. Between scorched edges and stained parchment, we glimpse the birth of a chilling realization that in a world where women's hearts were seen as vulnerabilities to exploit, the most radical act of leadership might be refusing to let love be turned into a weapon. Her eventual revenge was subtle but devastating. She secretly funded the rebellion that cost Henry his throne, proving that while fortresses could be taken, a duchess's will, once awakened, was indomitable. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It exposed the double standard at medieval power's core, where men's affairs were dismissed as youthful indiscretions. A woman's love could topple dynasties. Matilda's story forces us to ask, how many other surrenders, treaties, or wars began not in throne rooms, but in the quiet moments when someone's private heart was dragged into the light? The answer might rewrite everything we think we know about how wars were really won and lost. King John of England never suspected the woman sharing his bed was memorizing every word he whispered. Jeanne de Valognes arrived at his court in 1202, a widowed noblewoman fleeing French persecution, or so she claimed. Her letters to John, preserved in the Tower of London's archives, paint a portrait of devotion, pledges to serve no crown but yours, promises to weave my hair with your colors. What they concealed was far more dangerous. Each tender phrase was a calculated ploy, every stolen moment an intelligence coup. Jeanne wasn't just John's mistress, she was King Philip of France's most valuable operative, trained to exploit the English king's two greatest weaknesses, his paranoia and his hunger for admiration. The betrayal unfolded like a chess match. Jeanne's letters to Philip, smuggled inside hollowed-out prayer books, didn't just recount pillow talk. They exposed troop movements, revealed which barons John distrusted, even detailed his plans to reinforce Normandy's crumbling defenses. When Philip's forces struck at Château-Gaillard in 1203, they didn't just breach the fortress, they anticipated every countermove. John's commanders found their supply lines cut, their messengers intercepted, their garrisons mysteriously undermanned at the exact moments the French attacked. The greatest stronghold in Normandy, once considered impregnable, fell in months rather than years because Philip wasn't just fighting an army, he was reading its king's mind through Jeanne's ink-stained fingers. What makes this episode so devastating is how avoidable it all was. John's own clerks later confessed they'd grown suspicious of Jeanne's unnatural interest in military dispatches. One even noted how she'd pause her embroidery whenever fortification plans were discussed, but the king, intoxicated by her flattery, dismissed their warnings as jealousy. By the time a drunken French courier betrayed Jeanne at a Rouen tavern, Normandy's fate was already sealed. The spy vanished into the night, leaving behind a single unfinished letter that captured the tragedy perfectly. My Lord Philip will find the eastern gate unbarred, just as the English king's heart was. The loss of Normandy didn't just shrink John's territories, it shattered his reputation. Barons who'd tolerated his heavy taxes for the sake of continental glory now saw him as a fool who'd traded castles for kisses. The humiliation fueled the discontent that would later explode in the Magna Carta Rebellion. Yet the cruelest twist lay in the aftermath. While John raged, ordering Jeanne's phantom arrest, Philip rewarded his spy with lands and titles, and the rare privilege of signing her next letter with her real name. Because in the end, Normandy wasn't conquered by swords alone, but by the quiet understanding that sometimes the mightiest fortress has no defenses against a well-placed word and a carefully feigned sigh. This wasn't just a royal scandal, it was a masterclass in how personal weakness could undo military might. John's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In an era where kings styled themselves as invincible warriors, the most dangerous blows often came not from enemy blades, but from the vulnerabilities they refused to acknowledge in themselves. And perhaps that's why these letters still haunt us centuries later, because they remind us that power, no matter how absolute, is only as strong as the secrets we think we've buried. The autumn of 1415 was thick with tension as French and English forces maneuvered toward their bloody rendezvous at Agincourt. Among the French knights preparing for battle stood Jehan de Croix, a seasoned commander known for his sharp instincts, yet even he couldn't anticipate the disaster looming ahead. Days earlier, his secret lover, Isabella de Bourbon, had intercepted terrifying intelligence from her brother's war council. The French High Command planned a reckless frontal assault through freshly plowed fields, where their heavy armor would sink into the mud. She penned a frantic warning, urging Jehan to feign illness or convince his unit to hold back. But fate had other plans. The messenger she entrusted, a young squire named Thibault, never made it past the English patrols circling the countryside. Historians later found his skeleton in a bog miles off the main road, the sodden letter still tucked inside his jerkin. By the time Isabella's words might have reached him, Jehan was already leading the doomed charge, his plate armor dragging him down into the churned earth as English longbowmen rained death from above. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of one man, it was the cascading consequences of that single delay. Jehan's battalion, filled with seasoned knights who might have heeded his caution, became the vanguard of a slaughter that cost France nearly 6,000 lives in a single morning. What makes this moment so haunting is the fragile thread connecting decision and destiny. Isabella's letter wasn't just a love note, it was a lifeline that could have rewritten the battle's opening moves. Had Jehan received it, he might have swayed enough commanders to alter the French approach, sparing countless lives. Instead, Agincourt became a byword for military catastrophe, a defeat born as much from missed messages as from misplaced arrogance. The deeper irony, Isabella's warning proved prescient in the worst way. French chroniclers later described how their knights, bogged down in the mire, were cut down like wheat before the scythe. Her words, meant to save, instead became a grim epitaph, a testament to how quickly the tides of war could turn on something as simple as a delayed rider or a stray arrow. This story forces us to confront the quiet chaos of history. We remember Agincourt for its sweeping narratives of English triumph and French folly, but behind those grand arcs lie countless what-if small moments where a single piece of parchment, carried just a little faster or along a slightly safer route, might have changed everything. Isabella and Jehan's tragedy reminds us that in war, as in love, timing isn't just everything, it's the only thing. And sometimes the most pivotal battles are lost not on the field, but in the unseen spaces between the sending and the receiving of a heartbeat's desperate plea. The winter of 1429 should have been a time of truce. England and Burgundy had spent years carefully balancing their uneasy alliance through trade agreements and royal marriages. But when a single letter surfaced in the court of Duke Philip the Good, that fragile peace shattered like thin ice. The parchment, allegedly written by England's Queen Catherine of Valois, was a masterpiece of deception. Its flowing script confessed a secret love for Philip, lamented her forced marriage to King Henry V, and most damningly, hinted at her willingness to open gates for Burgundian forces if they helped free her from English rule. The letter's impact was immediate and devastating. Philip, already wary of England's growing influence, needed little convincing. He paraded the document before his council, framing it not as personal scandal but as proof of England's instability. By Lent, Burgundian ships were blockading Calais and pikemen massed along the Flemish border. The conflict that followed, later dubbed the Parchment War, would claim thousands of lives over 22 years. What made this forgery so potent wasn't just its content, it was its plausibility. Catherine, widowed young and known for her political pragmatism, had indeed corresponded with Philip about trade disputes. The forger, likely a disgruntled Burgundian scribe named Jacques Leclerc, had studied her handwriting meticulously, even replicating her habit of dotting I.S. with tiny crescents. But the true brilliance lay in the letter's subtext. By implying Catherine saw herself as a prisoner, it tapped into Philip's deepest insecurities about English intentions. The cruelest twist, Catherine likely never saw the letter that doomed her reputation. Isolated in London and newly remarried to a Welsh courtier, she learned of the war bearing her name only when Henry VI's regents accused her of treason. Her frantic denials were drowned out by the drums of marching soldiers. By the time a captured Burgundian spy confessed the forgery on his deathbed, entire generations had grown up knowing only war. This wasn't just medieval misinformation, it was a blueprint for how easily words could be weaponized. The forger understood something modern propagandists still exploit, that people believe not what's true, but what feels true. A single fabricated line about lonely knights in gilded cages did more damage than a volley of arrows because it transformed political rivalry into something primal, a story of betrayal that even the lowliest foot soldier could understand. The aftermath revealed an even darker truth. As the war dragged on, both sides began forging each other's correspondence regularly, fake confessions of battlefield cowardice, doctored orders to sack Allied villages. The very idea of written truth crumbled, leaving diplomats to rely on oral messengers and complex ciphers. By the war's end, the concept of a binding letter had become a bitter joke in taverns from Bruges to Bristol. Yet the most enduring legacy of Philip's forgery might be its chilling simplicity. No elaborate cipher, no invisible ink, just a few lines of script that leveraged existing fears so perfectly they didn't need to be authentic to feel inevitable. In that sense, the Parchment War wasn't started by a lie. It was started by the recognition that sometimes the right words, even borrowed ones, can make destruction feel like justice. The bitter feud between Lord Robert de Montfort and Lady Aelfrith of Wessex had poisoned the borderlands for nearly a decade until a forgotten letter changed everything. It began with a simple act of mercy. When Aelfrith's youngest brother was captured during a Norman raid, she expected the customary ransom demand. Instead, Robert returned the boy unharmed with a note explaining he'd recognized the lad's resemblance to his own dead son. That scrap of parchment, stained with rain and sealed with a falcon crest, became the first thread in an unlikely tapestry of reconciliation. What began as cautious gratitude soon blossomed into something far more dangerous. Through carefully worded letters carried by trusted monks, these sworn enemies discovered shared grief. Both had lost children to the endless skirmishes. Both longed for fields unburned and villages unplundered. Aelfrith's early missives were stiff with formality, addressing Robert as "my lord's noble adversary." But by the third exchange, she dared to write of hearing larks sing again after years of hearing only war horns. Robert's reply, scribbled hastily after a midnight watch, confessed he'd forgotten the taste of bread baked without fear. Their correspondence might have remained secret had drought not forced their peoples together. When famine struck in 1215, Robert and Aelfrith used their growing trust to broker a temporary truce Norman grain stores for Saxon well access. As starving children from both sides ate at shared hearths, the letters grew bolder. Robert proposed a radical solution to end the cycle of violence. Their marriage would unite the territories under a single banner. Aelfrith's response, preserved in the Canterbury archives, shows where history turned. Let our union be the bridge our fathers were too proud to build. The wedding at Michaelmas stunned the realm. Norman knights and Saxon thegns who'd slaughtered each other's kin now drank from the same cup, their weapons piled outside the chapel like discarded grudges. Chroniclers recorded the moment when Robert took Aelfrith's hand, not as conqueror or hostage but as partner, and pledged peace before a crowd still bristling with old hatreds. It took years for trust to truly root, but the marriage held. Their joint decree abolishing border taxes became the foundation for England's first cross-cultural trade agreements, while their children's bilingual court set a precedent for reconciliation that would echo through the ages. This wasn't just a love story. It was a masterclass in how personal connection could dismantle systems of conflict. Robert and Aelfrith proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act wasn't winning a war, but daring to lay down its weapons, one carefully worded letter at a time. Their legacy whispers through history that even the deepest enmities might soften when adversaries finally see each other not as monsters or abstractions, but as people who bleed, grieve, and hope just the same. The brittle pages tucked away in monastery vaults and rusted chests tell stories the history books often ignore. These surviving fragments, some no larger than a thumbprint, hold more than faded ink. They pulse with the whispered fears, reckless hopes, and quiet calculations of lives lived on history's knife edge. Take the water-stained scrap found in a Spanish convent, where an anonymous nun copied a noblewoman's plea to her lover before burning the original. If the king's men ask, say you found me weeping over psalms, not your letters. That single line, preserved by chance, cracks open a world of danger, revealing how love and devotion were often written in code, their true meanings hidden between the lines of scripture or shopping lists. Some discoveries rewrite entire chapters of the past. In 2014, restorers working on a 14th century prayer book in Bruges found palimpsests scraped away letters visible only under ultraviolet light. Beneath the Latin hymns lay passionate exchanges between a Flemish countess and an English knight during the 100 Years' War. Their words, once thought lost to time, exposed a back-channel peace negotiation that nearly ended the conflict decades early. The knight's plea, "Tell your lord husband that mercy now may spare his fields come harvest," shows how personal appeals could bypass the rigid formalities of royal courts. That these letters were deliberately erased yet carefully preserved speaks volumes about their dangerous power. Even the physical state of these relics tells its own story. A waterlogged chest pulled from a Venetian canal in 2009 contained moldering letters between a doge's daughter and an Ottoman admiral, their ink blurred into ghostly streaks by centuries underwater. Yet the seals remained intact, a silent testament to how fiercely their owners guarded these secrets. Forensic historians painstakingly reconstructed phrases like, "The moon over the Bosphorus is less lonely when I imagine you seeing it too," revealing an affair that might have sparked an international incident had it been exposed. The very act of preserving such letters was often an act of defiance, a refusal to let love be erased by politics or time. Monastic archives have proven particularly rich troves, not because monks were romantic, but because they were meticulous. When a noble family's line ended, their papers often wound up in abbey libraries, discarded as legal chaff, but preserved as scrap parchment for copying religious texts. Today, scholars poring over 12th century tax records in Clairvaux Abbey occasionally find fragments of poetry peeking through the numbers, a line comparing a lover's eyes to "the last ember in a dying hearth," or a plea to "meet where the river forgets our names." These accidental time capsules remind us that for all the grand narratives of kings and conquests, history was also shaped in stolen moments, hastily written notes, and the quiet courage of those who dared to put feeling to parchment. The most poignant discoveries aren't always the eloquent ones. A charred letter fragment from the siege of Carcassonne bears only half a sentence: "If the walls fall, know that I left forever unfinished." Was it a declaration of love, an apology, a final plea for help? The ambiguity itself is a haunting reminder of how much has been lost. Yet even these fractured messages matter, because they prove that behind every treaty signed or battle fought, there were human hearts weighing the cost. The parchment may crumble, the ink may fade, but the truth remains. History isn't just written by the victors. It's also written by lovers, dreamers, and schemers who dared to put their hearts on the page, not knowing whether their words would be their salvation or their downfall. Why love letters mattered more than treaties. Unlike formal treaties, love letters revealed raw, unfiltered truths. They exposed vulnerabilities and desires that diplomacy couldn't. In a world of rigid alliances, they were the wild cards. Think about it: official treaties were crafted by committees, weighed down by legal jargon, and signed under the watchful eyes of rival ambassadors. Every comma was debated, every phrase designed to obscure true intentions. But love letters, they were written in the dead of night, in moments of unchecked passion or despair, with ink still smudged from trembling fingers. These weren't documents meant for public record. They were confessions, pleas, and reckless promises scrawled without guards or scribes to sanitize them. And that's precisely what made them so dangerous. Take the case of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. His love letters to her weren't just romantic, they were political grenades. In one particularly reckless note, he raged against the Pope's authority, calling the Vatican a den of thieves for blocking his divorce. Those words, meant to seduce Anne with promises of defiance, later became key evidence in his break with Rome. A formal treaty would never have contained such explosive honesty, but a love letter, written in private fury, laid bare the king's true ambitions. Even more revealing were the letters that never made it into royal archives. Duchess Marguerite of Burgundy's scribes kept meticulous records of every diplomatic exchange except for the correspondence she burned herself. The sole surviving fragment, found tucked inside a psalter, reads, "When you speak of our children's future, I hear the rustle of banners being unfurled." That single line betrays what official chronicles omit: that noble women like Marguerite weren't just pawns in marital alliances, but active architects of dynasties, using affection as leverage in high-stakes games. The true power of these letters lay in their unpredictability. A treaty could be annulled, a marriage dissolved, but emotions, once confessed on parchment, took on a life of their own. When Isabella of Castile received Ferdinand of Aragon's early love letters, she didn't just see a suitor's flattery. She recognized coded offers, his willingness to share power, his hints at military support against her rivals. Their eventual union didn't just combine two hearts, it merged two armies, two treasuries, two claims to the throne, all because a few carefully chosen words on a page convinced her he was worth the gamble. Perhaps the most telling proof of love letters' supremacy lies in how fiercely they were guarded and how brutally they were suppressed. After the Duke of Buckingham's execution in 1521, King Francis I of France ordered every letter between Buckingham and the French Queen Consort burned. Not just the originals, but every copy, every draft, even the scribes' working notes. Why such thorough destruction? Because those letters didn't just contain sweet nothings. They held whispered state secrets, candid assessments of court factions, and most damningly, proof that a foreign power had been influencing English policy through the Queen's pillow talk. In the end, treaties told the world what rulers wanted it to believe. Love letters told the truth, and in an age where power depended on carefully constructed illusions, that truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. Centuries may have passed, but the dance between personal passion and political power hasn't changed, only the stationery has. Modern diplomats might swap wax seals for encrypted emails, but the human heart still writes in the same messy, unpredictable script. Consider how a single leaked love letter between a French president and his mistress in the 1960s nearly derailed NATO negotiations, or how a prime minister's late-night texts became fodder for blackmail during Brexit talks. The parchment has gone digital, but the stakes remain just as high. What medieval nobles understood and today's leaders often forget is that emotions can't be compartmentalized. When a 12th century duke penned sonnets to his enemy's wife, he wasn't just risking scandal, he was destabilizing a fragile web of alliances. Fast forward to 2017, when a world leader's unguarded tweets, fired off in pre-dawn frustration, sent shockwaves through global markets. The medium evolves, but the pattern holds. Personal feelings, once made public, become political earthquakes. The most effective modern diplomats have learned from history's parchment wars. They adopt the same careful duality as medieval scribes, crafting messages that speak in layers, where a compliment about a colleague's leadership might secretly acknowledge back-channel negotiations. Like Matilda of Tuscany hiding military strategies in her diary, today's envoys use coded language in press conferences, knowing every word will be dissected for hidden meanings. The difference, instead of lemon juice invisibly inked between love poems, we now have carefully worded statements designed to signal intent without explicit commitment. Yet for all our technological sophistication, we're still vulnerable to the same old traps. Just as a misdelivered letter once sparked the Breton War, a misplaced smartphone can now ignite international incidents. Recall how a German chancellor's private dinner conversation, accidentally recorded and leaked, froze trade talks for months, or how a romantic entanglement between diplomats from rival nations forced an entire summit to relocate. The players wear suits instead of chainmail, but the game hasn't changed because human nature hasn't either. Perhaps the most telling continuity lies in how we weaponize intimacy. Medieval blackmailers used stolen letters to manipulate kings. Modern hackers do the same with leaked emails and photos. The infamous 2016 cyber attack that exposed a candidate's personal correspondence didn't just sway an election, it proved that parchment or pixels, the contents of a heart laid bare, can topple empires. What would Elina of Aquitaine make of a world where a cloud server holds more power than a strongbox, where a tweet carries the destructive force of a trebuchet? The lesson scribed in fading ink across these centuries is clear. Diplomacy has never been just about laws or land. It's about the unspoken fears and desires that drive those who rule. Whether written with a quill or typed on a touchscreen, words born from emotion will always carry more weight than any dry treaty, because they reveal what formal documents can't. The vulnerability behind the throne, the secret hopes beneath the crown, and that, in any era, is the most dangerous knowledge of all. The art of reading between the lines was a matter of survival in medieval courts, where every flourished capital or oddly spaced word could be a breadcrumb leading to conspiracy. Paleographers, those linguistic detectives who decipher ancient handwriting, have uncovered layers of meaning hidden in plain sight. Take the curious case of Elina of Provos's letters to her brother in 1256. At first glance, they are filled with harmless gossip about tapestry patterns and troubadour songs, but look closer, certain letters are slightly taller, their ink fractionally darker. When isolated, they spell out warnings about her husband Henry III's mounting debts, a secret so explosive she dared not phrase it plainly. Invisible ink was another favorite tool of the clandestine correspondent. The recipe was simple: lemon juice or onion extract brushed onto parchment, invisible until heated over a candle. Pope Boniface VIII's spies used this trick to smuggle intelligence out of enemy territory. One such letter, now in the Vatican archives, appears blank until warmed, revealing a map of French troop movements scrawled between the lines of a grocery list. The genius lay in the disguise. If intercepted, the mundane surface text gave nothing away, while the real message lurked unseen, waiting for the right hands and the right flame. Some codes were even more ingenious. The Breton nobleman Bertrand du Guesclin crafted love letters where every third word formed military orders. To the untrained eye, they read as overwrought poetry. My heart aches like autumn skies when your laughter flees faster than swallows southward. But his captains knew to pluck specific words: autumn, flees, southward, revealing the command to retreat to southern forests before the harvest. This wasn't just encryption, it was performance art, turning affection into a veil for strategy. The physicality of letters also betrayed secrets. A quill pressed too hard might signal urgency, while a broken seal reused from an older letter could hint at financial distress. Scholars recently noticed that Isabella of Portugal's complaints about interminable rains always coincided with her husband's battlefield losses, a coded way to request reinforcements without demoralizing couriers. Even the choice of parchment carried meaning. Thin Italian paper suggested haste, while thick vellum implied a message meant to endure. Perhaps the most heartbreaking discoveries are the letters that wear their secrecy openly. The archives of Carcassonne hold a note from a Cathar woman to her husband, its margins crammed with tiny crosses. At first, historians assumed they were devotional marks, until someone realized each cross marked a day until the next heretic burning. Her faith was outlawed, so she hid her calendar of terror in the only safe place left, the empty spaces of a love letter. Decoding these messages isn't just academic, it's a reminder that in every era, people risk everything to be understood. Whether scribbled in lemon juice or whispered between metaphors, their words carry the same urgent truth. Even when kingdoms clashed and walls had ears, the human need to connect could never truly be silenced. From whispered confessions to explosive scandals, love letters were the unseen architects of medieval warfare, proof that history isn't just shaped by swords and treaties, but by the fragile, ink-stained hands of those who dared to write their hearts into existence. These weren't mere scraps of parchment, they were silent coups, diplomatic landmines, and sometimes the only bridges across enemy lines. Imagine a world where the fate of nations hinged not on the battlefield, but on whether a letter reached its destination, whether a seal was broken, or whether a scribe's hand trembled at the wrong moment. Consider the weight of that uncertainty, the knowledge that a single sentence, penned in haste or longing, could unravel decades of strategy. When Isabella of France's coded letters to Roger Mortimer sparked a revolution, or when Maximilian I's reckless note to Bianca Maria Sforza fractured the Holy Roman Empire, they proved that love and war were never truly separate. They were two sides of the same coin, forever spinning in the palms of those who knew how to wield both. And isn't that a power we still recognize today? The texts we send, the emails we draft, the posts we hesitate to publish, they might not topple kingdoms, but they alter lives in ways just as profound. A single message can mend a rift, ignite a romance, or cost a career. The medium has changed, but the stakes feel eerily familiar. That's the haunting legacy of these medieval letters. They remind us that words, once released into the world, take on a life of their own. So as we close this chapter, let's not just marvel at the past, let's interrogate our own moments of vulnerability. Have you ever sent a message that altered your path? A note that bridged a divide or burned a bridge? the echoes of those choices ripple forward, just as they did for Elina of Aquitaine and Richard the Lionheart. History isn't just something we study, it's something we live, one risky confession, one heartfelt plea at a time. If these stories resonated with you, share your own tales of fate-shifting words in the comments. And for more journeys where passion and power collide, don't forget to subscribe. Because the next great love letter, the one that changes everything, might already be sitting in your drafts, waiting for the courage to press send.